Hello everybody. I apologise that we couldn't be here today. I know that I'm missing a really exciting workshop and I am genuinely very sad that I won't be physically present to discuss this work and indeed to hear everybody else's presentations, which I know will be super interesting, so I apologise. However, I'd like to present the work that we've been looking at for a little while now, which is all about cooking complexity and indeed meal complexity in the general sense. We are looking at how to use simple annotations in the kitchen environment in a way that minimally disrupts participants. And so this work is based in part on annotation work that I will let my colleague introduce a little later on. And in part it is exploratory data analysis that we've done looking at those annotations and looking at how they fit with our data. I will introduce myself briefly. My name is Emma Tonkin. I am in fact a researcher at the University of Bristol working on a project called Sphere. So I am involved in several parts of it, from system integration through to the data management problems, through to looking at that data and seeing what we can do with it. My actual background is natural language processing and humanities and all sorts of different things that I've done in the past. So text analysis is a thing that I'm particularly interested in. Therefore, I found this a particularly interesting piece of work. You can find me on Twitter, by the way, and various other places where I opine about all sorts of things, but don't let that put you off.
Hi, my name is Hannah Berg and I work for We the Curious, which is a science centre in the centre of Bristol, but I am a citizen science officer. So what I'm doing is I'm delivering a project for Sphere, who is part of the research which you guys are here to see today. My role predominantly as the citizen science officer is to create an experience for the participants who've taken part in this research project. So the people that have had the sensors in their home for sometimes well over a year. My role is to create an experience for them, but certain elements of my role also mean going into their homes and collecting data for our researchers.
Now, data collection for healthcare purposes in general has an extremely long history. Of course, there's a little image that I've put on this slide here. That is, in fact, an image from way back in Florence Nightingale's time. She was very big on using infographics to try and understand what was going on, what worked well, what worked poorly, what they could improve to make patient outcomes better. So this is really work that has been going on for an incredibly long time. These days, I think the particular focus is very much in how do we get the information we need together rapidly, how do we get it in the right place, how do we get it to clinicians in a way that people who are overstretched, far too busy, can use it to rapidly get a grip on patient needs and ensure they get the support they need when they need it. And of course the other question that is very much on people's minds is what can we do to prevent issues arising in the first place? What can we do that is an early intervention, that is so early that it stops any need for expensive or complex healthcare involvements? Sphere as a project is a highly interdisciplinary project. We look at Internet of Things sensors in real homes. So over the last few years, we went out and installed around 50 homes with various types of sensors. The standard Sphere system is a combination of environmental sensors, visual sensors, wearable sensors. Environmental sensors include all of the usual things like pressure, light, temperature, water use, power use, and presence in the sense of PIR activations in the home. Visual sensors are in fact RGBD cameras, which are pre-processed to provide only silhouette information. So they aren't as identifying or as problematic from a privacy perspective as a full RGBD image, but they provide quite a lot of information about activity. We also use wearables, so sort of low power wearables that return accelerometer data and also provide the opportunity for localization using RSSI. Overall, In Sphere, we find ourselves with a lot of data and very few labels indeed, because we are recording for a year at a time. We put this stuff in homes, we leave it for a year, we come back every now and then and take some data away, but the vast majority of that data simply has no formal labels, no annotations at all. We have to guess, in some sense, at what is in there. And when we get a chance, of course, we love to pick up some annotations that can help us validate the guesses that we make, or indeed provide us with the ability to train a system to come up with better predictions of what occurs. Our motivation in looking at this particular area is all about nutrition. It's about understanding how people are living. Nutrition is incredibly important in health.
So part of my role was obviously to go into these people's homes and collect data for our researchers, and this data would then be used by researchers as training data to go on and teach their algorithms in artificial intelligence. But also my role was to curate that experience for the participants. So that created a really interesting intersection. I was going into these people's homes, creating an experience, but also needed to collect data. Now, one of the things we needed to collect data around was cooking. So cooking was an activity of interest for our researchers because it's an interesting activity which could potentially indicate someone's health, their behaviour, their mental well-being. For example, when I was going and talking to the participants about why we needed to do this activity, an example I would use was dementia. And there's a hypothesis out there that as you get the early onset dementia, the complexity of your cooking deteriorates over time. So the idea is if we've got a sensor system and a smart house that can detect the complexity of your cooking and how it could then detect that deterioration over time, that would be really important in potentially diagnosing dementia or catching dementia in its early stages.
But to understand nutrition, of course, we need to start with having a ground truth. And annotation really helps us with this. The problem that we have, having said we love annotation, it's great, it can be very expensive, it can be off-putting for the people involved, it can involve a lot of work for them, or alternatively it can involve less work for them, a lot of work for us, but very often the methods that we might use for post hoc annotation, such as the use of full-frame video, can seem somewhat intrusive. So we've used many methods in the past in Sphere. So we've used NFC tags, we've used diarising, we've asked people to fill out forms or work with apps, all sorts of things. We've explored voice input, lots of stuff. But in this particular study, we're looking at a particular method of real-time free text observational annotation, which is very social in nature. And what I'll do is I'll pass over to Hannah in a little while and ask her to explain the purpose behind that approach. I would like to pause and provide some definitions of cooking and meal complexity here. Cooking complexity we are defining as the extent and complexity of meal preparation, which involves preparation of foods specifically by heating ingredients. Meal preparation complexity in the broader sense we describe as the extent and complexity of meal preparation involving preparation of foods by any means, including combining, mixing, heating ingredients, so everything you do to make a meal. Meal complexity as such is the complexity of the meal as eaten, as we described it. So this we took from an existing paper. So here they separated meal preparation complexity into high, which are complex dishes using many base ingredients, medium, which are prepared meals, but these do use several ingredients. So for example, if you cook some rice and you cook some fish, you put them together, you've got a reasonably complex meal, but it's not extraordinarily complex. And low complexity meals, so really here we're talking beans on toast, or indeed we put it in a microwave, took it out, left it for 2 minutes, shook the box, opened it and ate it.
So with this cooking activity, what was quite interesting is I did some research into what was out there in regards to kind of cooking annotations or activities that collect these cooking annotations data, and there wasn't a lot out there. So this was a good opportunity for us within Sphere to maybe develop and explore a new technique for us to try of trial out how do we capture in their home some of their cooking activities that they're doing and how do we annotate that. So one interesting element of this kind of cooking activity was obviously I had a year to deliver this, so there was some time constraints there. So we needed to develop an approach that I could take into people's homes, but we had the ethics there for the Sphere project for them to have the sensors in their home. I didn't have time to develop an app or have time to process an ethics application. So a lot of it was kind of seeing what was out there, but I didn't have the ability to put a video that recorded colour in their homes and record their cooking activities. That wasn't something that was possible to me. Neither was kind of exploring creating a new app. So I had to look at things that would be acceptable to do in these homes, ethically okay to do in these homes, but that also, on the other side of it, kind of enhanced their experience, because part of my role was to enhance their participant experience. So I needed to make something that married both of these objectives of this activity. So in order to come up with this cooking activity, one of the first things we did was I went through recipe books, looked at recipes online, looked at cooking shows, watched endless amounts, and just kind of recorded all the different cooking bits of vocabulary that I could find. I worked a lot with researchers, and we kind of came up with this extensive list, kind of acting it out as well, understanding the difference between maybe stirring and mixing. But then we had quite an extensive list, so the next task was to kind of condense it into smaller chunks, so that we would have still quite extensive but manageable chunks to have as cooking annotations. So the next part, we had our cooking annotations. The next part was to obviously work out a method that we could use to collect these annotations. Now this was interesting because we obviously needed to collect a timestamp along with the moment they were doing that activity. And I think we tried a couple of apps that were already pre-existing, but we didn't go down the app route because the vocabulary we had was too extensive to put into that app. But also the app that we had access to, the time it took to actually press on scroll or find the thing that they were doing, by the time that I'd selected that correct annotation, that participant would have already moved on to the next stage of cooking. So what we came up with was an Excel spreadsheet, which meant that we could have a list of how much vocabulary we wanted to, and we input a formula that meant as soon as you start typing, it would note down the exact time to the millisecond that we had input that annotation. So effectively, if somebody was cooking, when I started writing chopping carrot, as soon as I put that into Excel, I would have a timestamp associated with the moment that I started typing into that Excel.
So, alongside Hannah's remarks on informal free text annotation, I would say that the primary guidelines that we have here are avoidance of survey fatigue, avoiding excessive demands on participants, minimisation of disruption, identification of sustainable approaches, so things that we could perhaps consider repeating on a number of occasions without, seriously discombobulating our participants. And our annotation targets are to ensure that we develop a better understanding of the requirements for annotation. As Natasha Noy describes in her well-known paper on basic ontology development, we are exploring the scope of what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to work out what our targets are, and we're working out what the minimum requirements really are to use this work in practice. And so this, in some sense, we view as a prototype and an exploratory study. Now, in terms of the annotations we get back, we find ourselves with minimally structured data. Ordinarily, the structure we have is something along the lines of verb, noun, so wash, dishes, peel, carrots, and so forth. These are somewhat similar, really, to free text tags or free text indexing data, which you find very often used in information retrieval. So they can be analysed using fairly similar methods and a fairly similar decomposition. To use these, you almost absolutely require pre-processing because they are a little bit messy as they come out of the box. So pre-processing methods that you would tend to include looking at the spelling issues that pepper this work. This is simply because people are typing fast and sometimes they put in new terms, and when you put in a new term, of course, it is very likely you make a little bit of a spelling error or a typographical error, and you end up with a word that is almost but not quite what you intended to type. Mostly you can just look at Levenstein distance or something just to do a simple spell check, pick the first answer, but sometimes this does result in misidentification, so you might find that stirring with one R can turn into string, or stirring with two R's. Of course, in the context, we probably mean stirring with two R's, but then on the other hand, if she's put tying with stirring, then perhaps not. So it is contextual. So you do need an element of manual review to get a high quality output from this. The verb form used also varies. So sometimes we're sort of saying active, stir the pot. Sometimes, most often, you see the gerund, so stirring the pot. That's what they're doing there. You get interesting distribution of term frequencies, so I would describe it as approximately Zipfian, which basically means that a few very common terms get used a lot, and lots of very uncommon terms get used only very occasionally. So if we have a look at this graph here, you'll see that opening shows up all the time. That's because opening happens all over the place. Stirring, very common, putting things down, cutting things, turning, pouring, and so on. But as you go down, you find yourself with the less common terms. Greasing, filling, crumbling, buttering, beating, things that mostly don't come up in every recipe, but you can see how these are quite idiosyncratic terms, but also quite characteristic probably of the specific recipe that a person is attempting to achieve. Some really unusual terms in here, as we'll see in a minute. So I think a really important point here is that some of these terms are probably a little too specific. I think that's one thing that you can probably get out of looking at this distribution. Perhaps there are simpler ways of expressing some of these points. Now, we had a look at this with WordNet sense identification, because that's often a really good first step to try and understand what you've got. And what we also did was we bunged it into the BNC, which is the British National Corpus. This is a well-known textual corpus, contains 100 million words of late 20th century British English, and it gives you a good idea of how common terms are. So what we found was firstly that some terms don't exist in WordNet at all, and that's because they're really interesting words. So here dolloping comes up at the bottom of that graph. It only appears once as a gerund in the BNC at all, so whereas dollop is used a fair number of times, squidging only appears once in the BNC, and in fact to squidge, it's a lovely descriptive term, but it only appears 5 times in the whole British National Corpus, and in 3 of those it's actually used as someone's name, so squidge, or I think perhaps it's an animal's name. Anyway, so we wonder, well, perhaps there are simpler synonyms at times, right? So we might ask ourselves, how much simpler could this vocabulary become, right? And so we ask WordNet to take a really basic approach and just look for synonyms. Now, this is not 100% reliable. It tends to pick up more synonyms than there are, and that's because it hasn't got a very clear understanding of the context in which we're using terms. Okay, this is a good place for us to sit and have a look and ask ourselves whether or not we are providing a bit more specificity than we really need to answer the question of what physically is going on in the room. Now, another clue is given to us just by looking at the predefined labels that were identified at the start of the study, as Hannah mentioned. Here is the set of predefined terms, so one can see that these are often quite specific. They come, in some cases, as she mentioned, from recipe books and so forth. A fair number of these don't get used, and partly that's just because of the recipes that people chose to do, of course. Right, so if we look at the unused labels, we don't use shallow frying, we don't use deep frying, grilling, placing, weighing, piercing, kneading, draining, baking or roasting. But there are lots of impromptu labels, so we've got arranging, banging, buttering, drizzling, plugging, poking, scraping, shaking, whisking, all sorts of terms that are shown up there. I think partly that is because there are some granular activities that are shown up as part of cooking that probably aren't directly identified in the recipe book. And so that is probably an identification of a requirement or a competency question for the terminology that's being developed here. Now, the other point that I think is perhaps interesting here is to think about these terms as what they imply for sensors. right? So what would you see from the sensor stream? And we see this when we look at the data. So for example, wash, fill and pour tends to imply water use. The first two of those will tend to imply literally tap activations in a large number of cases. Pour perhaps slightly less so. In certain cases, specific items will be implied. So in the case of washed dishes, it is very likely that hot water use will be involved somewhere, although perhaps not at the time that an individual dish is washed. Compound tasks often involve water use as well. So for example, peeling vegetables, at some point in there, it is also very likely that vegetables are rinsed. It is probably also very likely that the water use implied in that is not annotated at that moment, because it is part of that compound task. More difficult is the oven, because in many cases you will see that in mains activations, so the what's used in the home. But in the United Kingdom, many homes use gas ovens, which means that it will not appear directly in that. It will only appear indirectly as a form of eventual temperature and often humidity change. Boil and grill, of course, will also imply that temperature rise and may or may not imply electricity use. So the verb sensor footprint, what you will see when a verb goes off, so when someone sets off a kettle, for example, is somewhat idiosyncratic to the individual home, appliance, plumbing, home layout, all of those things. So looking very briefly at the data, as we don't have a great deal more time, we see, for example, that first one there is kettle activation. Kettles are very simple, they're a lovely square wave. What they aren't, though, is a very reliable square wave between different appliances. They do tell you quite a lot about the particular use of the kettle, though. You can identify roughly the amount of water used. And you can also identify reboils, so you can identify when people come back, switch it back on again, get it back up to temperature. Okay, so similarly to the kettle, below you can see mains usage, and on the left hand side there you've got a very nice clear set of square waves, which is a nice clear oven usage signal. On the right hand there you have a much more complex signal, and that does demonstrate how mains power usage decomposition is a very important task for us, especially in coping with those devices that cannot unfortunately be directly placed under observation. And very often that's the case with higher power usage devices, because it is not possible directly to put a current usage monitor on that individual device. So looking at indirect signals, these are quite interesting. So going back to that house again, where we see those nice square waves that tell us that the oven is on. Every now and then the element switches itself on, gets it back onto temperature. What you don't see is a very rapid rise in the temperature of the room. This does make a great deal of sense. I mean, the oven is well insulated by default, it would have to be, or it would be a terrible oven. Right, so what we in fact find is, if we go back and look at the annotations in detail, we find that the temperature in the room really starts to rise a little bit. It responds to that when the oven door is opened, when a thing has been cooked, and that, you know, once you open the oven door, then some of that heat comes out, then some humidity comes out. So what we've done there, just to give you an idea, because of course it is natural to see variation in temperature and humidity in the room no matter what. You are absolutely justified in asking yourself, might it not be the case that temperature randomly rose? So that nice continuous line there in each of these graphs, in the first two graphs, is the temperature or indeed humidity in that particular room. The dotted lines are analogous values in other rooms of the home that are not nearby. So this gives you an idea of literally not so much the absolute value, because that's not the interesting point. It is the variance within that room by comparison to other rooms in the home. So looking at the annotations that we've received, they are not perfect as what we would think of as classical machine learning labels. So there are obviously notable issues with granularity. There is no possibility for inter-rater reliability to be established, because there simply isn't another annotator in the room. Okay, but they provide a useful starting point to interpret the data that we see. and we feel that they are effective for validation purposes, but somewhat more difficult to use for training of machine learning classification algorithms. Going back to our main goal, which is evaluating nutrition, nutritional approaches in the home, looking at meal complexity, we've been able to identify common kitchen activities of various kinds, and feel relatively secure that we are probably seeing what we expected to see. So this means that we can now progress further towards validation against further ground truth and against the sort of ground truth data that we have available from diaries and so on and so forth. And following that validation, we hope eventually to move on to exploring changes in behaviour in a related dataset that we happen to be working on, which actually is also using the Sphere hardware, for which we have been looking at the recuperation of post-operative patients following hip and knee replacement operations.
One thing that I think was quite interesting about the experience and what potentially I would improve in future is cooking and the activities that people do is so fast. So when somebody's in a computer, the time from which they open a cupboard to get something out, to chop something, can be milliseconds, and you're there trying to annotate it at an accurate level. Now that was one thing I felt quite interestingly. It varied very differently between different people, because some people performed things very slowly, some people did things incredibly fast. So in the future, one thing that I think that would maybe improve this technique is obviously having a more set vocabulary, which could only be, we could only maybe come up with that vocabulary after doing this so many iterations that the vocabulary list stops growing. If that's possible is another question altogether.
Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I do apologise I couldn't be there, and I hope that you will contact me if you have any questions. Many thanks for your time.